Good evening. I'm Shelley Hornstein, and I teach architectural history and visual culture at York University. The annual Joan, and Martin Goldfarb Summer Institute in Visual Arts, now in its 7th year, offers York University grad students and the wider community the opportunity to engage with prominent international theorists, artists, curators, and critics through seminars and workshops and public lectures. Joan and Martin Goldfarb's dedication and support for the arts at York has made the School of Art, Media, Performance, and Design, our newly named faculty, into one of the largest and most comprehensive schools in North America. Joan and Martin Goldfarb, have been a major influence in laying a strong foundation for artistic and scholarly inquiry, not only at York, but also across Canada. This year, the Joan and Martin Goldfarb Summer Institute takes a look at the subject that I've called Sites and Sites, spelt two ways: memory, monuments, and place after the digital turn. This is an opportunity for grad students to engage deeply, intensely over 2 weeks with each other, with myself, and most importantly with our international guest faculty, and where we explore the writings of these distinguished speakers to investigate the pervasiveness and the shifting landscape of screen-based images in our everyday lives, and the feverish pace at which we create, disseminate, upload, download, remember, forget, save, and delete them. Also, we take a look at monuments, memorials, and public art, and what they mean as material objects in urban and rural space. Can we seek new identities and cultural contexts through mediated images on screens, for example? Or what does it mean to recognize the mobility of the image and its autonomy from physical place and material culture? How does a digital or virtual image situate people and place, network, contexts, cities, and geographies? Or what is the relationship between an ephemeral image and a material one? When images disappear, in other words, do we remember? And are we and our images and places truly mobile and connected at the same time? What is the enduring relationship then of tangible to intangible heritage? And what constitutes our cultural and collective memory? Finally, can digital images trigger memory as effectively as physical objects in land and cityscapes? Over the past few days, we have been under the influence, I would say, of James Young. Professor Young is Distinguished University Professor of English and Judaic Studies at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst, where he has taught since 1988. And he's also the director of the Institute for Holocaust, Genocide, and Memory Studies at that university. He's also taught previously at New York University as a Dorot Professor of English and Hebrew and Judaic Studies, at Bryn Mawr College, in the History of Religion, at the University of Washington, at Harvard, and Princeton as a visiting professor. He received his PhD from the University of California in 1983. Professor Young is the author of Writing and Rewriting the Holocaust, The Texture of Memory, which won the National Book Award in 1994, and At Memory's Edge, After Images of the Holocaust in Contemporary Art and Architecture. He was also the guest curator of a very important exhibition at the Jewish Museum in New York City entitled The Art of Memory, Holocaust Memorials in History, which went on to show in Berlin and Munich. And he was the editor of The Art of Memory, which was the exhibition catalog for the show. In 1997, Professor Young was appointed to the Berlin Senate, by the Berlin Senate to the 5-member Commission for Germany's National Memorial to Europe's Murdered Jews, which selected Peter Eisenman as the designer of the monument, which was finished and dedicated in 2005. He's also consulted with the Argentinian government on its memorial to the desaparecidos, as well as with numerous city agencies on their memorials and museums. More recently, he was appointed by the Lower Manhattan Development Corporation to the jury of the National 9/11 Memorial Design Competition, which was won by Michael Arad and Peter Walker in 2004 and opened, of course, very recently on September 11th in 2011, and I know he'll be speaking about that this evening. His articles, reviews, and op-ed essays on public art, memorials, and memory, national memory, have appeared all over in the New York Times Magazine, Book Review, op-ed pages, the LA Times, the Chicago Tribune, the Forward, the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, among other newspapers, as well as in scholarly journals such as Critical Inquiry, Representations, New Literary History, Partisan Review, the Yale Journal of Criticism, History and Theory, and I'm just skipping over a number of them, Harvard Design Magazine, Jewish Social Studies, Contemporary Literature, History and Memory, the Chronicle of Higher Education, Holocaust and Genocide Studies, Proof Texts, and so on, among dozens of other journals and collected volumes. His books and articles have been published in German, French, Hebrew, Japanese, and Swedish. He is the recipient of numerous awards and fellowships, including a Guggenheim, ACLS Fellowship, the NEH Exhibition Planning, Implementation and Research Grants, a Memorial Foundation for Jewish Culture Grants, and an American Philosophical Society grant, as well as a Yad Hanadiv Fellowship at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, among others. And in 2000, he was appointed as editor-in-chief of the Posen Library of Jewish Culture and Civilization, a 10-volume anthology of primary sources, documents, texts, and images forthcoming with Yale University Press. Presently, he is completing an insider's story of the World Trade Center Memorial entitled The Stages of Memory at Ground Zero, a juror's report on the World Trade Center Site Memorial. And so with that, I will turn it over to Professor James Young, who will speak on the arc of memorial vernacular between Berlin and New York.
Thank you, Shelley. I think I've got about 55 minutes of voice left after all the talking Shelley's had me do the last 2 days. It's great to see the seminar class here, and there won't be too much repetition, but you may hear the beginning of the talk tonight, which you've heard before. Don't stop me if you've heard it before. In January 2004, after 9 months of intensive and exhaustive discussion, our jury of 13 chose Michael Arad and Peter Walker's design for the National 9/11 Memorial competition. Their design was called Reflecting Absence. This after reviewing 5,201 designs from 62 countries around the world. We had ended up with 7 finalists, 3 further finalists, and after working long into the night at Gracie Mansion, which had been given to us just for this use by Mayor Bloomberg, we arrived at a decision, a 10-3 vote on the night of January 3rd, 2004. Now, Michael Arad and Peter Walker's design it's a gorgeous design. It's called Reflecting Absence. 2 gigantic voids in the footprints of the former World Trade Center towers, each with a further void at its center with waterfalls coming down the sides, planted in an abacus grid of trees and groves of trees, which thereby deepen the volumes of the voids as the trees grow larger and larger over time. It's very much a memorial of the moment. This kind of vernacular is in the moment. And we weren't allowed to talk to the press until we had announced this winning design at Federal Hall, where George Washington had taken the oath of office, downtown New York. And shortly after, we were now permitted for the first time in 9 months to talk to the press. As I told our seminar class today, the first question I had was both annoying, interesting, and I thought almost a little offensive. So a reporter from the New York Times called and said, so, we know that you were on the jury for the Peter Eisenman design in Berlin. We know that you worked closely with Daniel Liebeskind and have kind of partnered with him a little bit. We know that Daniel Liebeskind is the site plan designer for the World Trade Center, new World Trade Center, downtown. You've written widely on the voids in Liebeskind's work in Berlin. We know that Maya Lin was on your jury, and we know that Michael Arad is indebted to the work of Maya Lin, and we know that all the memorial makers in Germany that you've been writing about, the counter-memorial makers, are indebted to Maya Lin. It's all very interesting. But in the end, haven't you, jurors, just chosen another Holocaust monument for Ground Zero? I thought, oh, he's very clever. He's fishing for some kind of a response, angry response. And so I handled it and said, obviously, no, it's not a Holocaust memorial. But as I began to formulate an answer, my mind went back to a dinner I'd had with Maya Lin in 1988, where we had both given talks at the Graduate School of Design at Harvard on memorials. She talked about the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, which she designed, and I talked about Holocaust memorials and even some counter memorials. And at dinner that night, she said that, I have to tell you that my Vietnam Veterans Memorial design owes a great debt both to a Holocaust memorial and to a World War I memorial at the Battle of the Somme. And the Holocaust memorial I'm indebted to is this memorial by Henri Pangusson, here dedicated in 1962, but really conceived and first kind of designed by the architect, I think as early as 1958. And Maya had said that she used to go sit at the memorial in Thiepval, the battle of the dead of the Battle of the Somme, in the Edward Lutyens Memorial, and then she would come sit here and contemplate what it meant to sit in this carved out space on the little island of the Ile de la Cité in Paris, right with Notre Dame Cathedral, just behind the photographer here. This horizontal memorial, not a memorial that you climb up, it's not a triumphalist memorial, but it's one that you descend into, down some very, very narrow stairs, which begins to block out the rest of the city of Paris, blocks out the Notre Dame. You can see the little spire of Notre Dame Cathedral there. It's a memorial that you don't run up against, and it doesn't defeat you, but it's a memorial that has now open space, a negative space in the ground, into which you've now descended to leave you alone with your thoughts. And as she talked further about it, I thought, well, actually, what you're saying that really appeals to you here is that this is a memorial that kind of opened a space in the landscape that would open a space within us when we entered it for memory. That is, that the memory is being returned to us. It's not a gigantic obelisk telling us what to think, lording it over us, but it's opening a space in the landscape that we enter, and we become the memory site within this open space. And she agreed. The only way to look out when you're down in this little crypt-like setting is to look out this kind of grilled window. It's not a glass window, it's just kind of an iron grill. And you can see the River Seine coming this way. And if you go back out and cross the river to see what this looks like from across the river, you look and you see kind of the prow of a ship. It's like a jutting prow, the water coming by on both sides. But inside that prow is the space where we sit. There's a triangle motif, first of all, as in the triangles that the prisoners of concentration camps wore, the names of the various concentration camps here. But then there's this space. And when she returned to Yale after her junior year abroad in Paris, she entered, in fact, her whole class, memorial design class, being taught by Vince Scully, entered the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Competition, and Maya Lin submitted this design. A beautiful, simple, elegant pastel. It's the opposite of the aggressive flying wedge, the spear, perhaps the most aggressive architectural form we know, which is the jutting elbow, because she's taken the jutting elbow and then turned it like this. Only in this drawing can you see what looks like this very aggressive elbow, because it's hidden, it's flush with the ground. But when you come inside, you're now invited. This turns into this, and you're invited to come into the crook of the arm and descend into this space. One axis points to the Washington Memorial, one points to the Lincoln Memorial. So she's attempted to integrate it on the one hand, but she's also obviously counterpointing all of the conventional memorial monuments, the giant neoclassic white obelisks, counterpointing now with what she calls a cut in the ground, which then she opens up. A wound which opens up and which does not close and does not mend. She was looking for some form, some articulation of America's great ambivalence toward the memory of the Vietnam War, their great ambivalence toward the return of the Vietnam War veterans, but still a place for the Vietnam War veterans to come and remember their fallen comrades and soldiers in arms. She wanted something humanly proportioned. She was countering the traditional overweening memorials, which make us feel small. The only figures we see in her memorial are our own reflections. So the memorial, the figures are as big as we are. In fact, they are us as we look into them. They do invite touching, carvings, and rubbings. People leave without even being invited, little teddy bears, mementos, medals, bottles of Jack Daniels, combat boots, to mark their visits. And in so doing, she really created now a counterpoint, not just to everything going on in Washington, while integrating it, but she found a way to formally articulate the painful relationship of Americans in 1980 to the memory of a war that they grew to abhor. And in so doing, she gave a whole generation of German artists and architects a vocabulary, a vernacular. But hers is indebted now to World War I, to the Holocaust itself, the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, has now created kind of a break in the mold for a whole new generation of German artists and architects who are wrestling, struggling with how to commemorate an entire people murdered in the national name. Commemorate a genocide perpetrated, against the Jews, murdered in the German national name. And it's something nobody's ever done before. The German problem, is kind of so intense that it was something that, even conceiving of a central memorial to Europe's murdered Jews in the middle of Berlin, it took them 70 years just to get there. There were hundreds and hundreds of other memorials around Germany, obviously on the sites of destruction and all kinds of projects. But this was now 1986 before we began seeing the very first responses to Maya Lin now in Germany. They felt that Maya Lin had now given them permission to find a way to articulate something that the nation would actually prefer to forget. In this design by Horst Hoheisel, in the first competition, the 1995 competition for Europe's murdered Jews, the Memorial to Europe's Murdered Jews, Hoheisel proposed taking the Brandenburger Tor and blowing it up, covering over the entire site with granite plates. How better to commemorate a destroyed people than by destroying your national monument, he asked, knowing that, of course, it would never be done, but that was also part of the point. Maybe it shouldn't be done. maybe there's no such thing as a solution to this, to this conundrum we have. How to remember a people murdered in your name, how to reunite Germany on the foundation of a murdered people, in your foundation of memory of a people murdered in your name. It's never been done before. Jochen Gertz and Esther Shalev Gertz, in 1986, won a competition. I talked at much further length today about Esther's role in this particular memorial. She was what I would call one of the very first counter-memorialists in Israel, actually, during the Lebanon War in 1982 and 83. But she and Jochen got together and proposed that maybe we have too many monuments. And thinking about Maya Lin, they said that, maybe we should create a memorial that goes away. So our memorial for peace and against fascism and violence will be a disappearing memorial. So they fashioned this 12-meter tall column covered in soft lead, and then an inscription inviting citizens of Harburg and visitors to add their names to ours. And as a 1.5 meter section is filled up with these names, we will sink the memorial, thereby kind of counterpointing all of the memorial's traditional conventions of permanence, longevity, inviolate, somehow inviting its desecration here. And then in the end, it is only we ourselves who can rise up against injustice. They were very suspicious of memorials from the outset, that in fact, all this memorial making might just become a substitute for real action against new genocides and new persecutions. So enough with memorials already. Let's create a space, open a space in the landscape that will invite us to assume this mantle of responsibility for remembering. Don't leave it up to these big objects in the landscape. And of course, everybody came out in the first few days and added their names quite respectfully. But before long, it became kind of a scribble-scrabble of graffiti, swastikas, as you see here. The mayor was outraged, said, but this is horrible, we've got to get rid of this. And the artist simply said, you are getting rid of it. The faster you cover it, the faster it's going to go away. They loved the sight of Germans bearing their anti-fascist memorial. How to remember something you'd rather forget? By making it go away. And thereby, kind of challenging all of the memorial's traditional premises of permanence, longevity, inviolateness, something that's, they're all illusory, they feel, and leaving only the visitor standing in that site, having the burden of memory returned to the visitor. Little by little, it began to disappear. Between 1986, when it was dedicated, and 1993, in fact, November 9th, 1993, Germany's National Day, if they ever had one, it was finally sunk, and this is what you have remaining. Again, open that space for the people to come and stand. Now, we discussed in the seminar today that all the ins and outs of these counter monuments, and if that's all there is, then you've got nothing left, which is all true. And they're meant to be process art. They're meant to kind of generate each other, spawn each other, and they're meant to actually to counter the traditional monuments and come together so that you have this constant dialogue, a dialectic between traditional and so-called counter memorials. Not long after this, Jochen Gertz taught a class at the Institute of Fine Arts in Saarbrücken, a class on memorials, in which he invited half the class to go out and steal cobblestones from the rest of the town, and then to return at night and have kind of a beer party, banging bottles and things here, as they dug up cobblestones from the Saarbrücker Platz here. The Schloss had been actually Gestapo headquarters during the war. And then they took the stones from this plaza up to the classroom, where the other half of the class was researching every single Jewish cemetery in Germany destroyed by the Nazis between 1933 and 1945. 2,162 of them. They carved the names of each one of these into each one of these stones and then returned them under the cover of night to the plaza. But of course, this being a Jochen Gertz production, they returned them inscribed side down. So any trace of this project is now hidden from sight. People came down to see this memorial, this invisible memorial, and the students simply said, look within yourselves for the memory you seek here. That is where you will find this memory. And of course, the only vertical forms in this plaza are the people who come down to visit this memorial, which is now called 2,162 Stones Against Racism. Horst Hoheisel, who had proposed in '95 to blow up the Brandenburger Tor, exactly at the same time the Gertzes were doing this, this disappearing memorial, he proposed a negative form memorial in Kassel to remember a fountain which had been donated to the town of Kassel by a local Jewish philanthropist just before World War I. This memorial, the Aschrotbrunnen, was destroyed by Nazis in 1938 and turned into a flower garden, which they called Aschrot's Grab, Aschrot's grave. And he wanted to take the original form of the fountain and invert it into the ground and create, in his words, a pedestal for people who will now come looking for memory and become the monuments themselves. So he too is now carving this into the ground, and he too would then credit Maya Lin with this negative form, this thing built into the ground. The space opened up to accommodate ourselves as we come to remember here. All of these, kind of initiated independently of each other. It was really kind of a sign of the times. This is another project. Not long after, an international competition was held for the Berlin book burnings of March 1933. Micha Ullmann, an Israeli artist based part of the time in Germany, won the competition with his proposal for a memorial he called Bibliothek. This would not be a statue of books in flames, but would now be a room built underneath the Babelplatz with a steel tablet over here describing the book burnings and what happened there, and another steel tablet with Heinrich Heine's eloquently prescient words, where books are burned, too, so one day will people be burned as well. The only vertical forms in this plaza are the people who come looking, and they stand around this window and they look into it. This is what they see: a room of empty bookshelves, an empty library, bibliothek. The books cannot be compensated, they cannot be replaced. They're lost as their writers, as their authors were lost forever. There's nothing redemptory here. There's no way for this to be made whole again. Emptiness is remembered by emptiness. The void of a murdered civilization is remembered by the void. Loss is remembered by loss. And this preoccupation, goes on and on. And so I'm mulling all this in kind of a flash second as I'm mulling my answer, to the reporter. And then it was at that moment I began to see this arc. And I realized that that reflecting absence is not a Holocaust memorial, but all of kind of cultural productions after the war have been inflected in some way by the Holocaust, regarded as a huge breach in civilization. A generation no longer willing to find consoling forms to remember the inconsolable. No longer will these memorials redeem this loss with beauty or with order. Germany, in particular, must not be allowed to grieve its victims and find some kind of consolation at the same time. Remember destruction with destruction. Remember voids with voids. Poetry, painting, architecture, all of these forms had taken this into account and taken this to heart. So that my answer ended up being, no, it's not a Holocaust memorial, but all of art and culture and literature in some way have been inflected by memory of events which can never be redeemed. And this is what is done to this generation of artists, Michael Arad included. We have Rachel Whiteread, known for what she used to call materiality as an index of absence. And she won the Viennese, the Judenplatz Memorial Competition with something called Bibliothek also. In her design, she has taken just the space between the leaves of a book against the wall and kind of turned that library inside out. It creates kind of a cenotaph on the one hand, but in the other, she wanted to articulate absence, just that space, to articulate it, to formalize it without filling it in somehow. And the stories that accompany that, of course, the Viennese weren't very happy about this memorial, kind of ruining this place. They said, this is the Judenplatz. We've already commemorated the Holocaust by calling this Judenplatz. And of course, it's called Judenplatz because it was the site of a pogrom in the 15th century in Auto da Fe, where the synagogue here was burned down with all of its congregants alive inside it, all of them murdered. As they were excavating for her Bibliothek memorial design, they in fact found the timbers and found remnants of this Auto da Fe. And they said, see, why don't we make the remnants of that pogrom the memorial? And Rachel Whiteread had to remind them that if they just went around the corner, they could see the commemoration of that pogrom in a tapestry in the church right next door, which said in Latin on this tapestry that on this site in 1426, the flames of hatred arose against the Hebrew dogs to punish them for their crimes. That was how it was being commemorated. It was being justified and explained. And so they went ahead with this memorial. And remember, Michael Arad and Peter Walker are completely familiar with all of these. Shimon Ati in Berlin was alarmed by what he didn't see when he went to Berlin in 1990. And so he went to study the archives and found hundreds of photographs taken of stateless Jews in this neighborhood in the Scheunenviertel in Berlin, just what had formerly been East Germany, East Berlin, and projected them back onto their original sites. They're just gorgeous, and I think he showed them here when he came to speak. The bookseller, the bookstore here. And here, of course, he was reminding everybody that by themselves, these sites are essentially amnesiac and inanimate, that they demand our projection of what we know back onto them. And that when he turned off the light, then he hoped that this image would now kind of be retained, in the back of the mind's eye. And so it would always be there, that we would internalize this and take it away with us, that memory happens within us. It doesn't happen in the landscape form. And then this takes us back to the failed competition for a national memorial to Europe's murdered Jews. And that story's been told often enough, I think, that I can, I can show you here, the three finalists, basically, and suggest why we, in the end, in 1997, chose the Peter Eisenman design. This one by Daniel Liebeskind had a little bit too much of Daniel Liebeskind in it. It was kind of pointing toward the Jewish Museum with its 6 voids. We did like this segmented wall, and we liked the way he overran the site to go into the Tiergarten on the left there, and would end up right in front of Goethe's bust, his statue there. This designed by Gesine Weinmiller has that echo of Maya Lin's descent into that space, also opening that space up. And then she has scattered gigantic segments of limestone blocks reminiscent of the Kotel, or the Western Wall in Jerusalem. And we found as we walked around the parapet and came to that right-hand corner and looked into the space, that these seemingly randomly arranged segments congealed and composed into a Star of David, and as we walked away, they kind of fell apart, all 18 of them, of course, 18 being a number in Hebrew gematria for high. And then the Peter Eisenman design, along with Richard Serra. We were attracted to this, but we actually liked the Gesine Weinmiller design more, and I was like her biggest champion. I liked the idea of a young German woman now winning this design competition. But the Germans, of course, were very interested in getting coverage and making sure that they've got a star architect, to make this design. So back and forth we went, and we had a series of public discussions, public presentations, and everybody ended up coming down on the side of the Eisenman-Serra design, but we had some big changes to make. They proposed this waving field of 4,200 Stelle, maybe echoing a cemetery, but except that instead of very rigid up and down Stelle, these would kind of be waving, animated like a field of wheat. But we worried that it would, in fact, be literally dangerous. It would be a place where kids would run out over the tops and fall. People would get lost completely. It became, one of us referred to this as the Venus flytrap of Holocaust memorials, where people would go in and never come out. Some people said at that point, let's just keep this big space designated by the government empty. Let the void be the memorial. And of course, what this space had been before the wall came down was truly no man's land. This was a minefield. It became a political minefield later, but it was a literal minefield before 1989. We're pointing this finger, Gunther Schluss's hand is pointing right to where the space is. And if you follow the flagpole right to the tip, you'll see exactly where Hitler's bunker was. Unmarked, it's marked now, but it wasn't marked then. You could always see it by a gaggle of tourists with their GPSs looking down and pointing down at the ground, so that's where you knew Hitler's bunker was. So this is truly central part of Berlin, a great site. We asked them to downsize it, to reduce the number of Stelle, to open up space around the edges, to introduce life and trees along the edges. Peter Eisenman happily did this. When Richard Serra found out about it, he said, "This isn't my memorial anymore. My memorials are dangerous. They're meant to be dangerous. Workers are killed building my memorials." He said kind of proudly. There's big Corten ellipses which fall over and kill the workers trying to install them. And we said simply that we don't want this literally to be dangerous. We're okay with a figuratively dangerous memorial. We want people to be a little bit threatened by this memory, but we actually don't want anybody to die here. So Serra left the project, leaving Eisenman happily alone in it. And we did vote it in. We made the recommendation to the Bundestag. It got completely caught up in the political elections of 1998, eventually became a political football. Schroeder and the SDP and Michael Naumann, who would be the culture minister, didn't want anything to do with it. They regarded it as Kohl's monument. Helmut Kohl, of course, said, "Well, it's not my monument." We had this process. And so Naumann and Schroeder decided that they probably wouldn't build it. But then when they went to put together a governing coalition, their only governing coalition friends would end up being Joschka Fischer and the Green Party. So they had a red-green coalition. And Joschka Fischer said, "Yes, I'll join the coalition, but only if we build the Denkmal." So to have a governing coalition, the Denkmal had to be built. Joschka Fischer got what he wanted. He became the Secretary of State, or the foreign minister, and was invited by Bill Clinton in 1999 to take part in the NATO bombing raids against Serbia and Kosovo to stop what would certainly be the next genocide of Albanian Kosovars, Muslims, in Europe. And he announced quite simply that it's not enough to build a national memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe if we actually don't do something about it. And so he amended a national law which forbade German troops ever leaving German soil again, except now, he said, except in the event of intervening to prevent a genocide. So this memorials being accepted did finally have a policy effect here. It went forward. It was finally dedicated in 2005. And here, it came to inspire, eventually, the 9/11 memorial in ways that you're going to see. This is an abstract design. There's nothing in it that says this is, there's nothing visually to reference the literal mass murder of Jews here. And so we gave them a three-part vote. We recommended to the Bundestag that they vote up or down. Do you want a national memorial to Europe's murdered Jews in Berlin? If yes, do you want Peter Eisenman's revised design? And if yes, do you want a place of information to be built underneath, a narrative that will historically support the memorial and explain what it's commemorating? And they voted yes on all three. And this memorial was then dedicated in 2005 with a place of information built underneath. And yes, people do hang out. It's a public site, and the tourists stand on top, and yes, they do walk across them, and they sleep on them, and they have picnics on them. And underneath, there's just they've allowed quite beautifully, I think, the appearance of the stele to come down and shape the space underneath, so that the stele would now be seen as shaping the historical space beneath, and the historical space beneath would now be seen as supporting the memory space above. And you even get the sense of interpenetration between the memory space above and the history space below. And so there's a very simple but powerful narrative in 4 rooms of what exactly happened, what exactly is being commemorated here, down below. Shelley pointed out in this particular picture, of course, that, which is why I used this picture, that it looks a little bit like a Star of David with this guy, kind of jumping through it. So that was 2005 when that was dedicated. All this discussion was, was underway when in 2001, September 11, 2001, let's see here. All of our other little ones seem to have disappeared. Oh. Oh, there they are. They were just a little bit slow. Sorry. Okay. Oh, you've lost it altogether?
Yeah.
Okay.
Let's give it a second.
Okay, so we're gonna.
Okay.
I don't see the slideshow option now.
Okay, which one are we on?
We want to do this one here.
Oh, I think it froze. There we go.
Yeah, it looks like.
Start from start?
Yeah, thanks.
All right.
So in 2000, I published At Memory's Edge with a final chapter devoted to Germany's Holocaust memorial problem and mine, and described the process kind of in the way that I described the building processes and all of these memorials as process, using the term early on that every memorial needs to be conceived of as a stage of memory and not as a final or fixed memory. This book came out in 2000, on September 11, 2001, New York, and the World Trade Center towers and the Pentagon were attacked. And there was this sense that it happened to everybody. It's reported that over 1.6 billion people around the world watched live TV and watched the towers come down on that day. It was truly kind of an international event. Reported by everybody. The New Yorkers, ironically, the people who lived above 14th Street or so, had lost a lot of their antennas on the World Trade Center towers, so they actually couldn't see the images that everybody else was seeing around the world. And when they asked me, within 2 weeks, I was invited to come advise on how to commemorate these attacks. And I said very simply that it's not memory yet. It's unfolding. We don't know what it means. The only people who know what it means are those who lost loved ones, who have direct, literal loss. And they remember their lost loved ones. I said that I think you need to step back and think of the memorial as in stages. The memorial, maybe it began on the very first evening of the attacks. Candlelight vigils in Washington Square here, in Union Square, on the promenade in Brooklyn. This is where the memorial is. You know, these are spontaneous memorials, vernacular memorials. Think of the memorial having begun maybe the moment people saw it on TV, and then it got replayed over and over again. They do say that somebody who experiences trauma, who has this kind of this post-traumatic loop, feels like it happens over and over and over to them again. And of course, mass media replayed it over and over again in a way that traumatized and seemed to re-traumatize billions of people as they watched. Think of the flyers, the thousands of flyers all over Manhattan, all over the boroughs, Queens and Brooklyn, Staten Island. Think of these as memorials. And here, a motif is now established. Have you seen my brother? Have you seen my mother, my sister? Missing, absent, the people who never came home, people whose remains were never found. Over a third of the victims who died left no remains behind. They were completely atomized when the towers came down. And often there'd be descriptions of who exactly was lost, what their names were, what their children's names were. And it was a funny way in which these were almost like tombstone epitaphs, but as ephemeral. They're paper tombstones, blowing away in the wind, as ephemeral as the lives turned out to be. What was being commemorated? What were people remembering? Well, if you didn't know anybody, you were remembering the towers, the kind of unloved towers until they were gone. And so there was this weird conflation. Candles, towers, memorial candles burning, the towers burning. It was a very common motif. On the other hand, the firefighters knew exactly what they had lost, and they knew why. They didn't happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. They came from all the boroughs. They flooded in. They walked the last 2 miles if they had to. That's as close as they could get, with 100 pounds of equipment on their backs to go down and to go up the stairs, 80 flights of stairs, to rescue people. That was their job. Were they going to be remembered differently than the office workers who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time? And can you remember them differently without creating a hierarchy of victims? And this was something that was crucial. The culture of firefighters' families meant that they knew that they were heroes. And that's what we do. And they had to be remembered differently. And so this question came up at the very end when we went to presenting the names on the parapets. How then do you do this without creating a hierarchy of victims? How do you do this without creating privileged remembrance? And in the end, we decided, and that Michael Arad had a great idea, we will do this in what he called meaningful adjacencies. The names will be arranged so that everybody's name gets to be arranged near the people that their families want them to be arranged by. And that the firefighters would be marked just with a ladder company number, and the police officers, rescuers, would be marked by their precinct office numbers, and that would be it. So they would be marked, and often they were clustered together because that's where they wanted that's where the families wanted them to be. At several stages, people said, "Stop there. That will be the memorial," and we had to we had this ongoing conversation. Well, if you stop here, you're basically memorializing the site the way that the bombers would want it remembered. This is the bombers' memorial, not New York City's, not the nation's. So some of these parts of the facade became quite iconic. Other remains were also iconic. This kind of coincidentally cut iron cross became kind of a memorial motif for the firefighters, and it made perfect sense that it would. In fact, this was moved off-site, and now it's going to, next year, it will be moved back to the perimeter of the site. The 6-month anniversary of the attacks was commemorated in what they called a tribute in light. These two lights, light towers, they were called originally Towers of Light, were to have celebrated the World Trade Center Tower's 30th birthday. And they were conceived as a celebration just the year before by Creative Time, an arts agency downtown. And now they are being used to commemorate their destruction. In our jury, we actually mandated that they be shown every year on September 11th, and they have been. Quite lovely. And on the first anniversary, we had families come, read the names of lost loved ones, ongoing, and the cleanup process is ongoing. So in thinking of this memorial in its long durée, from the moment of the attacks through the cleanup, through the posters, through the candlelight vigils, through the tribute in light, to the very first anniversary, reading the names, descending down to ground zero, and putting flowers in these two little reflecting ponds, which end up being kind of replicated 1,000 times bigger by the reflecting absence voids. This would all be part of the stages of memory. And then they asked, so what comes first, rebuilding or remembering? And so the LMDC had this little triadic motto, renew, rebuild, remember. Which one first? And the answer was, it doesn't matter. Begin wherever you begin, and the others will follow. So they began in 2002 with an invited competition for designs for the master planning of the World Trade Center site. 2 finalists emerged. This design by Frederick Schwartz and Raphael Vignoli, kind of a skeletal towers here. Office space would only go up about 80 floors, but then it would be empty above that. Critics liked this a lot. The LMDC liked this a lot. But the families hated it because they said, this is a skeleton. This remembers death in buildings. And even though these architects weren't invited to design memorials, both Liebeskind and the other one, and Frederick Schwartz and Vignoli, proposed memorials as part of their rebuilding design. So this think team proposed this void articulating the footprints, even though they weren't asked to do this. Governor Pataki looked at both designs of the finalists and said, I'll take this one by Daniel Liebeskind. The asymmetrical spire would, of course, echo the Statue of Liberty arm. The families loved this. It seemed somehow more patriotic. It was about life and ongoing life. And he could tell a very good story around it as well. And so the governor made an executive decision, overruled the LMDC, and just said simply, the families want this one. That's the one we're going to take, thereby privileging the families and their needs. And so this was what we had to work with. This was declared in January 2003 that this was the winner, actually February 2003. And in March, a competition was now announced for the World Trade Center site memorial. And a jury was chosen. I was invited, Maya Lin, Michael Van Valkenburg, who had actually chaired the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Competition jury many years before. There were 13 of us. And this was Liebeskind's huge open space, which he wanted to kind of just sod the footprints of the towers and leave them open as a memorial to the towers, and to build a culture center over the top of one of them to encumber the footprints in ways that wouldn't be allowed in the memorial competition. In April 2003, we were announced, Paula Grant Berry, the wife of a man who was killed, the mother of 3 children, announced this design competition with Maya Lin, you can see in the background, along with the rest of us. And by August 1st, actually by July 1st, we had received 13,800 registrations from 90 countries. And by August 1st, we had received 5,201 design boards from 62 countries. This is what they looked like as they came into the warehouse. It was 100% anonymous. They were all given barcodes, recorded by the competition management company, which was great. And then we, the jurors, were given 200 boards at a time to view. This process was described to the press, and I think it was the Post, the Daily Post said, it's impossible. If they had 200 boards at a time, they would have to do this 12 hours a day for the whole month of August. And that's exactly what we did. 12 hours a day for the month of August. We did see every single one of the boards. We had passion votes. Maya Lin's design was actually brought through the first several stages by a single passion vote until it came into discussion with others. And so we included that passion vote in our process. Any one of us could bring forward one board into the next round, but otherwise these boards needed 7 out of the 13 votes to go forward. Part of our process, so we did this during the day, and then at night, we had these listening sessions where we were asked just to sit up on a stage at the Tribeca Center for the Arts and listen to 400 family members describe their grief. And some of the jurors were very uncomfortable with this. They said, well, they're going to lobby us. And I said, no, this is part of their mourning process, and we need to be informed by it. We don't have to do anything about it. We don't have to do what they say, but we need to listen. And it did have a huge impact on us and our relationship to the family members. We had weekly